Good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to a brand new episode of The Joy of Logistics. We are already at episode number 6, and today we are going to continue our talk about the AMH, the American Maritime Highways. And if you're wondering, and maybe you're watching the first time today, and if you're wondering, hey, who's this Christoph guy? Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Christoph. I'm your host. I'm the host of the Joy Logistics. I also post a lot about all developments in global logistics on LinkedIn under the hashtag Planet Logistics. I hold a bachelor's degree in which is focused on economics and logistics. And now or today, I've been roughly working already a decade in logistics. Specialized on ocean freight, meaning all sorts of container movement, as well as air freight shipments. And the focus is on the transatlantic, particularly on the US, with all sorts of different motor transports and also custom solutions. And I started this podcast in order to shed some light upon logistics, and that's also part of the reason why I named it Joy Logistics, because logistics and supply chain management should not have to be a nightmare, in my opinion. It should be fun, and I know a lot of people disagree on that, but that's okay. That's okay. To me, it's fun. I love the challenges, and specifically with this podcast, I also intend to set up a stage for out of the box concepts, out of the box thinking people and companies, because I believe that, especially in this day and age, where back in the day, this was supposed to be the future, where everything is more easier and automated and more efficient and whatnot, which it is to a certain degree. I want to set a stage and to offer a stage also for some food for thought concepts and people, because I believe it's vital to keep challenging the status quo and to keep thinking and dwelling upon new, or let's just say different approaches, different concepts, and see where they fit in best. That's basically the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I enjoy what I'm doing. Today, as you might have guessed, and as you also know from the LinkedIn introduction and invitations, I'm not alone. I have an amazing guest with me. Number one, Pat, you already know, but today I'm also joined by Mr. Richard Butcher, and he is, amongst other, managing director and also author. And but I'll leave the introduction up to him. Richard, thank you so much for taking your time, for being here. A warm welcome.
Thank you, Christoph. Appreciate the warm welcome and the introduction. I suppose, where do I start? I've been in this industry when I had hair and it wasn't grey. I was probably about 35 years ago. And I started in the container logistics business, the container shipping business, and got a quite an interesting introduction to the whole industry back then. Times were different. Lots of different things happening back then. Many more shipping lines, many more ocean carriers. Same sort of number of containers floating around the industry, though. And basically, my background has been very focused on consulting and advising different companies. I've held some fairly senior roles in my time, working with some major technology companies in this sector and consulting for ports, shipping companies, and container logistics companies. It's taken me all over the world, and I've been very fortunate and very exciting times. But I think we enter a whole new era now. I think in the last 2 years, we've seen a very different shift in the whole industry, and the whole sector has changed topsy-turvy, really. We've seen a lot of shortages across the supply chain. We've seen some major issues with the ocean carriers and how they've tried to adapt to COVID. I think COVID has come at the right time. And actually, I was writing an article for a leading trade magazine. I was asked by a leading trade magazine to write an article about the impact that COVID has had and the impact that the industry is facing now. And everybody is coming out of this glorified high freight rate scenario. And I think the reality of that is starting to strike home. I think the industry's had quite a successful 2 years. I think the majority of the top 10 ocean carriers have seen something like $580 million, I think. Is it maybe more than that? Like collectively, in terms of profit lines, and that's unheard of in the industry. I think that now that sort of party's coming to an end, the hangover is starting to kick in. And I think the fear of what's going to happen next in the carrier sector is really coming home to roost. With the world economy starting to have a little bit of an issue, shippers' confidences have come to a little bit of a slowdown. I mean, shippers are now sort of becoming very select about making investments in terms of cargo and their buying patterns. And of course, this is having a rub-off effect. Well, coupled to the ocean carriers going out ordering extra large tonnage. So we're seeing next generation ships starting to come through on the different routes, and these are starting to come into operation. 25,000 TEU ships. You know, these monsters need cargo, and the commercial people are being told to go out, fill these ships, get cargo in, and obviously this is going to have an impact on freight rates. And you know, we're starting to see that, and most of the CEOs of the top 10 ocean carriers are sort of predicting harder times come 2023. And I think this is really sort of starting to bite home. I mean, they've made record profits. Now, what are they doing with that money? We've seen them, as I say, they've been buying into more ships, newer generation, cleaner ships with lean burn engines. They've been investing in logistics companies. They've been getting into the air freight markets. You know, you're seeing CMA getting into the air freight markets. Maersk has actually said, right, we're going to put most of our money that we made, a large proportion of it, into the inland logistics sector. Now, that's where the hub of this sort of concept that Christoph and Pat have been talking about. What happens with the inland logistics, and how do you develop that? If you look at North America, the infrastructure in North America is coming up to 50 years plus old. A lot of the road and freeways are old. Bridges are getting old. Rail networks are old. You've got a slowdown in the growth in terms of trucking. So where do people turn to? How do people turn to this? So if you look at it, the whole concept and the model is alternative forms of transportation in North America. Yes, road is still going to be there as a percentage, but on a diminishing scale. Trucking rates are pretty dismal. Diesel costs are escalating to a very high level. And then you've got all the different associated costs with running a trucking operation, which is pretty astronomical. Pat, I'm sure, will be able to sort of tell you about that when he comes online. So, you know, where do I fit into this whole mix? Well, I look at technology, and I look at how do you build the bridges between the various component pieces and build a better infrastructure in terms of the logistics movements and the supply chain patterns. And, you know, I'm fortunate enough to have worked with quite a few different technology companies around the world. So I've had an experience of knowing where the industry is heading or should be heading, and optimizing freight movements is critical. I mean, the majority of the ocean carriers, they if you look at their revenue model, the ocean leg, prior to COVID, was minimal, but the inland leg was where they could either make it or lose it. So now the ocean legs have been phenomenal for the last 2 years, and the hinterland movements, well, they haven't really given too much concern about that, because majority of boxes are being backlogged at different ports on the east and the west coast and Gulf Coast of America. And so trying to get that clearance, cargo clearance, has been a big issue. Now, that's a question of COVID. It's been a question of trade restrictions. It's been a number of different things that have impacted the flow of traffic from ports in North America to the hinterland movements. But technology is a key driver. So, I think it's a question of how do you introduce certain things to streamline the process? How do you get better visibility across the supply chain? And a lot of companies are doing that. A lot of companies say they can do it. A lot of people are introducing tracking of containers through RFID tags or RFID chips, but that only goes so far. And you've got to question the viability of that. I mean, last month or the month before, I think the chief executive of Hapag-Lloyd stood on his two hind legs and said, "Well, guys, we're gonna spend a vast amount of money to RFID tag over 3 million of our containers." Now, you've got a question: is that a viable proposition? No, I'm not sure. And so to try and get better visibility, and you've got a question: is how can they physically do that, and is it actually a viable proposition? But so people are starting to look at how can they get better visibility, and how do you interface, and how do you link tracking into the inland moves, because that's where you can make or lose a lot of money. I was talking to a Californian company two weeks ago now, and they actually assess the risk on a supply chain patterns. They sort of look at it and say, okay, let's take a container and piece of cargo moving from Shanghai to the Midwest, and they can analyze every part of the chain as to the risk levels and the cost and the associated costs. And then they can bring it back to the line and say, look, we can calculate this out, and we can sort of look at changing certain trade routes or trade patterns and how you move things. You can make or break, and we can visualize this over, you give us the data, we can number crunch this data, and we can start building out holistic models that can show you positive and negative results across your supply chain. And when you're moving hundreds of thousands of boxes, that's a lot of money you've got to consider. So, Christoph, I've spoken a little bit now. Maybe throw it back to you for some.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for your introduction, Richard, and also for diving head up front, so to speak, right into the topic. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, what you just alluded to, I mean, that's a perfect description. I couldn't have said it any better. I mean, you also see that, just want to circle back with what you mentioned with regards to those so-called windfall profits the carriers made, which were, as you said, astronomical high. I mean, prior to COVID, we've seen whether it's Allianz that has been bought by Hamburg Süd back in the day, CSAV bought by Hapag-Lloyd, Hanjin which went bust, so to speak, or bankrupt, for lack of a better terms. So it was really operating on razor thin margins. And as you already alluded to, the land portion is where the money is made. Respectively, also when all sorts of let's call them special requirements were met, whether it was of course dangerous goods, but especially when you initially, let's say you booked a container to Kansas City, Chicago, but all of a sudden you want to terminate it in the port of Los Angeles or Houston, or depending where it's coming from, right? Just a random port. And those additional movements, maybe even in combination with the customs exam, and the demurrage and detentions afterwards, this was where the money is being made. And while in the US we still see that a lot of demurrage and detention has been or is still being collected up to the very date, which you also already alluded to, is, I think, to a large degree caused by obviously on the one hand side the driver shortage and the missing chassis and trucks and whatnot, but on the other hand side for sure, the out of fashion or the very old infrastructure, whether it's terminals themselves, whether it's rail connections, whether it's the rail themselves, which is just fully overwhelmed to move the amount of boxes coming in, and on the other hand side, the empty containers that are still over there not being able to
they're not being moved.
home.
I mean, Christoph, if you look at the number of containers sitting throughout the US depots are chock-a-block with empty containers gathering rust. And my question is, the ocean carriers have been a little bit sharp in their practice, and well, more than sharp, where they've been buying containers from the manufacturers, getting these boxes at a certain rate. Now, those rates have gone up because materials have increased significantly. Now, you can only do so many one-way trips on them, new boxes, until you get to a choke point in the inland, at the port level and the inland infrastructure level. And round tripping of equipment is not carried out very efficiently. If you look at it, 30 odd million boxes around the world sitting idle. How many of those boxes are sitting idle? If you take the top 10 ocean carriers, how many of their containers are actually in operation, in flow, or actually sitting idle in depots gathering rust? And I'm not a CFO of an ocean carrier, but if I was, I would be very concerned about the rapidly depreciating asset that's sitting there, costing not just the depreciation on the books, but it's also costing a lot of money in terms of millions of dollars in terms of storage charge, repairs, insurance, you name it. They're getting charged for this. Now, if you were to able to deplete that number of boxes, if we were to look at the reduction of number of containers around the world, and you got better triangulation, I think we'd start getting a better flow of boxes in and out. And I think triangulation, it's, as you said, detention and demurrage charges are there, but how many of those are actually imposed? Because you can't get, the commercial people get very funny when you start talking about demurrage and detention charges. They don't want to upset Mr. Walmart's, they don't want to upset Mr. Home Depot, Mr. Lowe's. They start getting very funny when they start looking at this. So, talking to them and saying, well, I want my box back. And, or you've got to come and pick this box up. So, they give them so much grace. The commercial people are driven by fright of losing a major shipper, and the shipper still wields quite a big axe. Although I say it in general, there aren't as many ocean carriers out there. There's still sufficient to give the fear of a big shipper moving from one line to the other. And I think, commercial people, when it starts talking about demurrage and detention charges, it's a threat. How much of it's an idle threat, I think. So I still believe that if we, the whole concept of what you're talking about is moving cargo through the river networks in North America. Now, okay, last year or this year, we've had tremendous droughts. So places like the Mississippi, the river levels have dropped significantly, which has caused problems for container barges and of that nature coming up and down the river. But there is some, I forget what the statistics were, like 330,000 miles of river networks, navigable networks across North America.
It's crazy.
And what we're talking about now is the smart ports out there, the smart big terminal groups like the DP Worlds. I think DP World leads the world in terms of smart innovation. Maybe not in America because they've got a little bit of political things. But if you look at APMT or TIL, MSC, those guys they've also made quite good money in the last few years. And what I'm seeing is they could start setting up better distribution hubs and to focus more logistics hubs around river conurbations. And if you started moving cargo down the river networks, then you could start getting better utilization of assets, physical assets in North America. I mean, obviously the costs, timeframes will always come into it. Time-sensitive cargo, as Pat said, I think in the last session, time-sensitive cargoes will always need to reach a location at a certain point. But there is still an awful lot of cargo that isn't time-sensitive. You could take that off the roads and start moving it either through feeder ports. And I think the other thing, I'm a bit radical out of the box thinking. I think shipping lines should start looking back and saying maybe we should start getting smaller, more fuel efficient ships. Now those smaller vessels could make secondary port calls to smaller ports that could cope with those ships and not have the backlog of the big guys like Port of New York or Baltimore or LA,
even Los Angeles. Right. And I just want to jump on what you just mentioned, Richard, because those are some very important points, and absolutely. And on the one hand side, I understand somehow carriers logic talking about economies of scale and all of that, and this from an economic point of view, this absolutely makes sense.
I question that as well, Christoph. I think economics of scale. Now, you think how quickly now port and terminal operators are having to invest millions of dollars in technology to better turn around the vessel, to get that vessel turned within the contractual agreements that the ocean carriers impose on those terminals. They want that ship turned with the quickest time, with the least problems. And so the maximum efficiencies have to be called in. Now, the economies of scale come into play. So the ocean carriers say, well, you can have one of my 24,000 TEU ships and I might discharge 5,000 boxes and I might load 2,000. But for that, I want better rates. So if you're going to get me, and now the margins are squeezed harder for the terminal operators. So they have to start thinking every time they move a box, it's cost them money. And I can pinpoint dozens of terminal operators around the world, and I've spoken to quite a few, that have transshipment cargo, and they are losing millions of dollars a year in inefficiencies within their terminals because they are moving. They're running at 98% capacity, but they are not being able to figure out where logically a box should be positioned for the next place. And on average, some of these terminals are moving that transshipment box up to 4, 5, 6 times that they shouldn't be. And every time they move that, that's costing them money. So, if putting volume through a terminal is not always a great thing. And rates, they only want cheaper rates. The ocean carriers are sharks. They'll rob the terminals blind, and the terminals will sit there and say they'll take it because they want the trade. They don't want to lose it. But I think the smart terminal operators are the ones that are starting to look beyond the gates and starting to say, look, we need to set up better distribution hubs, better logistics. We need to use multimodal systems. We'll invest in these things. Now, people like DP World or, TIL or APM terminals, they're all looking at this. Well,
they have to. Just really quick, want to clarify, Richard, what I meant by economies of scale, because obviously at one point there has to be a reason for ocean carriers getting and buying larger and larger and larger vessels. And you're right with the terminal side, and of course I don't have as much insight as you have, But I was thinking more in terms of, you put more containers just on the ocean leg, just talking about the ocean leg here, meaning probably less fuel, I suppose. I don't have any data on that, I have to admit.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. Large ships
Mhm.
have certain economies of scale, but large ships it's a double-edged sword. With economies of
For
scale
sure.
and size comes major problems. If you look at the
Hmm.
next generation ships, not many of the US ports can even handle the next generation ships. They're too big.
Same as in Europe.
And
Same
so
as in Europe.
you're going to, and some of them can't even go through the Suez Canal. And
Hmm.
those that do cause all sorts of problems. Oh, sorry, Evergreen. But you've got people like the Panama Canal that are dredging it because they're worried about the size of the vessels. And once you call one of these big ships in, the time it takes and the resources, the time it takes, it can, if you add it all up over a port call, over their service rates, the time it takes to turn these ships round, are they really the costs alongside a berth? You're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and every hour delayed is a chip off their margins. Now, the last 2 years, they haven't really given a hoot, but all the CEOs are now starting to turn around and say, Jesus, next year's going to be tough. We're going to have to figure out how we're going to save some money. And, it comes back down to the CFOs that are going to have to sit there and say, well, we're going to have to sharpen their pencils and start saying, well, look, we got to cut costs here, we got to cut costs there. And all this has an impact across the supply chain. And,
Right.
we're also entering a bit of an unknown time with, certainly here in the UK, with interest and inflation rates going through the roof, and that's being felt right across Europe, and the ripples have come from North America.
Correct.
The markets in North
If
America are not particularly great at the moment. So the ripples of a potential 2023, 2024 recession are there. So, ocean carriers have got to figure out what their logical steps are. Now, tying in closer links with the shipper is vital. I mean, the shipper's their lifeblood, but they've also sort of robbed the shipper blind over the last 2 years, and they haven't really provided them with a brilliant service.
Correct.
When
If you can call it service at all, if you can call it at all, I mean, no
debatable,
container
yeah.
equipment available. Even talking about Europe, talking about Switzerland, Czech Republic, whatnot. Depending on the shipping
Yeah.
line, you had no chance to get anything. By the way, quick shout out to Doreen. Thank you so much for watching and for joining live from Beirut in Lebanon. Great having you online. Thank you so much. And of course, what you mentioned, and that's also quick link or lookout to next year. I'll be having a very interesting guest online as well, that I'll be looking forward to talking about a special sort of containers, which, by the way, for the US would be brilliant in my opinion, especially talking for inland operations to decrease the amount of space required for empty containers. And also, I think that's also important for barges, if of course the river level are high enough, to ship the empty containers to, let's say, from Tennessee or Kentucky down to Mobile, Alabama, for instance.
Well, what I mentioned earlier, Christoph, about this company in California that look at the supply chain across from certain points to certain points, from origin to destination. Now, if you had that complex software in place, and you could fine tune certain things, so you could start looking across your booking patterns and seeing which cargoes are time sensitive, which are not so time sensitive, and you could start looking at ways to maneuver those less time sensitive boxes and cargo onto alternative forms of transport. Now, river and rail, rail's still quite good for distance in America. You're not going to beat that for distance, but certain areas, feeder vessels across the East Coast and West Coast, probably still very good. You could probably operate a good feeder service that would take cargo, you could have that sort of service. And then, of course, you've got all the major river arteries. So you could start assessing things and taking a much clearer pattern, instead of just saying, okay, throw it through the system, and then we'll figure out, is it going to be road, rail, feeder, barge, maybe. And
Or
they don't really know.
Demurrages.
Sorry.
Sorry, and I said sorry to interrupt, but I was just saying, or in case the system is so overwhelmed, we just start charging you detention and demurrages and make a good additional profit on the solid container, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think analyzing cargo bookings is another thing that ocean carriers are a little bit. I think their systems are very antiquated at best. Most of the major shipping lines are running legacy-based systems and I've been in this industry a long time, so I know a large proportion of them are running at least 20-year-old systems, 20 plus years old systems. They are really running old systems, and they're regionally. Some try and say they've got a global vision. Some say they've broken it into regional levels, and some go down to area levels. But if you look at it, they're focus on bookings, which should be critical. If you start looking at how booking forecasts and projected booking forecasts, and you start looking at that and start bringing that back in, you could become much finer and tuned about how many containers you actually have as in operation. And having all this safety stock, the logistics people sit there and say, oh, well, we know the booking people are always 10, 15, 20% out. So we'll always keep a safety stock of containers in certain key areas around, North America, Asia, Europe, you name it. They'll stick containers in there. Now, how many of those actual containers actually get used?
Correct.
And how many of them actually sit? And no shipping line today. And I did a poll not 10 days ago. 20% of about 40% of the votes were showing that 20% of the container fleets sitting idle. Of their total fleets. And and that's a major thing. So I think if we started looking at how do the shipping lines take bookings, if you can get the number of containers in circulation reduced, and you start looking at better systems, start spending some of that money on better systems, because at the end of the day, that's where you're going to see the savings. And next year, instead of them all sitting there saying, oh, well, we didn't make this, we didn't make that, and our shareholders are going to kill us, let's start looking at this in a positive view and start taking positive action, positive steps, and start saying, let's introduce certain things across our operations that can save us money. And they're all doing it in some way, but they're a little bit, I don't know. Logistics has always been a bit of a big industry.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm with you on that, Richard. And quick shout out here also for Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining. Appreciate your interest in this topic and in our conversation. And Richard, what you're pointing out here, and I also want to circle or focus a little bit more also on I will just call it holistic concept in terms of the software, because as you already alluded to, some of those are pretty antiquated, to put it at best. And I also know, particularly for the US, you also have to use, especially for inland cargo or inland moves, you also have to use different tracking signs, meaning you have to use, depending on the shipping line, of course, shipping line, rail, maybe even terminal provider, whatnot. And on the other hand side, you see, as you also alluded to, everybody, which seems to be the buzzword of the day, other than sustainability, but smart here, connectivity there, intelligent containers, intelligent whatnot. how would it actually be possible? And I just take Hapag-Lloyd now as an example because you already brought that up, and it's perfect fit in my opinion. Let's just assume January 1st, 2023, they'll really have all their 3 million plus containers fully smart or fully connected, so to speak, being intelligent containers, whatever that might mean. But let's just assume that's really the case, which will be hard to pull off anyways. But what sort of value add can they actually bring if the rest of the whole supply chain, and particularly with the US probably, is not so intelligent? And what I mean by that is, if the terminal or the rail
lacks of integration there. I mean,
correct, if they can't connect and talk to each other, there is no holistic approach, in my opinion. What's your thing or your thoughts on that?
Christoph, 25 years ago, I worked for a company called Kiva, a Transtema. They were a bunch of Swedish company, technology, probably one of the earliest players in the market 25 years ago. And 15 years later, we were coming, or 20 years later, not even 15 years later, sorry, we were coming up with a product called iQuator, which looked at the supply chain and looking at how do you get all these components linked in. Now, the internet wasn't really ready at that time, but the concept and the model was there. And we're still looking at this model 25 years later and still thinking, well, how do you slot all these different things in? Because you've got different, you use a variation of vendors, suppliers. Yes, of course, the big guys like Maersk are trying to tie in with key people and say, look, if you want to ship or move our cargo or containers, you've got to have systems that are integrated and provide us with some visibility. It depends on where they are, but some visibility, because obviously, depending on the value of the cargo, and this is where I think that shipping of containers only comes into high value cargo, electronics, food, that type of thing, where you've got time sensitivity comes in and people want to know that that cargo is going to reach that location there and there ain't going to be any delays, or if there is a delay, let's know about it before it happens, hopefully, and so we can be a bit proactive in the situation. Now, that's not easier said than done, but in some cases, I went to a supermarket yesterday and big Tesco's, one of the biggest in the world. The shelves were bare, and it's a superstore. And you think you're going in there to buy vegetables and fresh goods, and a lot of the areas were bare. And I'm thinking, this is a major superstore, and so you've got to look at backlogs in the supply chain and how are they dealing with it now. Tagging 3 million containers, I think, is a complete and utter waste of time. And I think what we've got to do is really look at what type of containers should be tagged and what the value of that is. Now, high value containers such as tank containers or reefer containers, they probably would be beneficial to tag, because you look at an investment, their capex investment for those are quite high, and they want to make sure that they're getting optimal use. They don't want them sitting in depots. They want to keep them flowing. And of course, the value of those containers is high. Now, if you look at a 3 million container fleet, how do you then break that down into the age of the box? Am I going to put $100 tag on a 12-year-old box? No, why would I? No. Am I going to? And then you're only going to get certain visibility across a percentage of your fleet. And I think the only time tagging will come in is when you actually start saying, we're going to dispose of a whole series of boxes. And that's usually when the ocean carriers go out and make an order to Mitsubishi or Hyundai for a new ship. And then Mitsubishi or Hyundai say, do you know what? We'll give you a discounted rate of X for 300,000 containers, which you can then load onto that ship, and or ships. And then you can then move those boxes around as you want. And that's at that point, maybe tagging comes into the sense, because you're replacing aging boxes. But to try and tag, physically think it will be an impossible task. And I think you've got to look at the age of the box, the condition of the box. You know, a box only has a lifespan of 12 years. Ocean carriers will maybe keep them for 14 years at a stretch, but then they've got to look at the depreciation and they've got to look at the repair costs. So the associated costs might be far greater than the value of the box. So then they start thinking, well, we need to reduce the number of boxes. Now, if you had smarter systems, do you need as many containers in the first place? That's my question.
You don't, because I would say, or I would argue that a shipping line then could actually, as you also mentioned earlier, Richard, is they can make use of the data and gain more efficiency, you know, meaning really understanding how they're floating, so to speak, or in which directions they are floating. Plus, in addition, I would also say, let's just, as you said, with regards to the cost of these smart or connected containers, on the other hand side, not every cargo and not every shipper requires that. Meaning, of course, as you said, and I'm with you, it makes sense, high valuable cargo, but also perishable cargo, meat, fish, frozen stuff, maybe high value beverages. Okay, granted, but what about, you know, scrap metal? What about all sorts of trash,
paper and products? But you know, all paper and stuff like that, it's usually used for backloads to try and get some contribution on the back end. But even those, if you look at it, even taking backloads, you know, in the old days, you used to say, okay, we'd rather take some contribution to cover our repositioning costs than no contribution. But if you then look at where that box has to finally go, the contribution might be eliminated from the inland move on the import side. So you've got to have pretty clever software to figure out, am I going to accept a repositioning load if I make money, or it covers my costs and I'm not going to charge anymore? Let's do it. But if I'm getting a box and I've got to then move it and it costs me another $200 on the other side, and I'm not getting compensated for that because it's a flat rate, do I want to move it in the first place? So, you know, ocean carriers don't really like moving empty boxes. And I think if you look at it, there's some $23 billion a year spent moving empty air around the world. And it's you know, not just the cost, but then you've got the CO2 emissions. Every box that's moved empty, that's a CO2 red mark, black mark against the ocean carriers, you know, eco-friendly mode. And you've got to say, well, do you need those? And the question is, do you need as many containers? And if you can bring that number down and make money more efficiently, you know, the ocean rates and the cargo rates, which are going to come down, and they will come down with a big, massive drop, it will not hurt them as much, because then they're becoming more aware. Instead of wasting money going out and doing all these other things, which they seem to be, like Maersk has decided to send every employee blue shoes.
Right.
What crazy notion is that? I mean, we've got too much money, so let's just spend it on, you know, send them a pair of Adidas blue shoes with the Maersk logo on it. You know, I shouldn't be saying this, but I'll probably get sued by Maersk tomorrow. But
but let's just assume that Maersk or maybe Søren Toft from MSC is actually listening to our conversation, and maybe they're like, oh wow, this Richard guy, man, he has some really interesting ideas. Okay, and let's just assume they would reach out to you and say, okay, Richard, you made some great points here.
Søren Toft is a very shrewd man. I mean, he's leading MSC to become the biggest shipping line in the world. And I think Maersk is stepping back. Maersk has always, Big Blue's always been number one. But I think Maersk is now refocusing their position. They're sort of saying, well, it's not so important to be the number one on the ocean leg. It's number one on the inland leg. So I think their priorities are changing. I mean, and then you've got the crazies like COSCO that are saying we're going to flood the market with additional tonnage, and then come to the market and say, oh, well, we want to be your friends. Costco are doing some crazy stuff. I mean, they're gonna
Let's
bring
buy
these
the port of Hamburg.
Yeah.
But again, back to the question, and let's just say one of the CEOs or CFOs of those shipping lines listens to us, and they will reach out tomorrow to you and say, okay, Richard, you made some pretty good points here, but because our systems are so old, what would you suggest that the better or the next generation system should have in terms of data to make sure that we are covering exactly what you pointed out? What would you tell those guys?
I think they've got to strip out a lot of the excess within their IT. If you look at somebody like I want to say Maersk probably spend 1.5 to $2 billion a year on IT. And
wow.
Is that how many of those projects are really viable, valuable? And really, I think the next generation should become much leaner in terms and agile. I think the architecture and the frameworks, you could probably strip out a lot of things and build a cloud version. And I think there is a lot of stuff moved via the cloud within these ocean carriers, but a lot of it's still sent by EDI messages and legacy-based systems. And I think if you look at it, I would start looking at a lean, agile model. You could probably build a system for less than what they spend a year on M&S. you could probably build a cloud-based system for 50 million, and you probably could put I would build hooks in so that we could take best of breed technology and filter that in and integrate it. You need a good integrator. You need somebody that's got the abilities to bring all this together, and an integrator will sit there. I mean, CMA, CGM have got an integrator. I think they've got Infosys now, but they're sort of looking at it. But they're playing with a 20 plus year old system, CMA. So it's the fundamentals you've got to get right. So you've got to go back to the core systems. Like how do you even figure out how many boxes you've actually got sitting in a depot, and then I would work it from projected forecasting, projected bookings. Then you can move to the logistics side and start saying, okay, how many boxes do we actually need? And then obviously you go to the actual the brains of it have got to be sort of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So you build that layer. It's almost like a cloud layer, and then you build a thin architecture above that or below it. And then you start drilling in and bringing key data up. And I think I think some people say data is more valuable than gold or water or platinum. But I think data is only valuable if you can get the benefit. And the moment you get data, and I digress a little bit, but the other day I was talking to somebody and we talked about dashboards. Now, dashboards are wonderful things. But at the end of the day, a dashboard, it's the data is obsolete the moment you get it. So you have to have something below that to actually integrate and to work things out, to take away all the manual process. So what you get is really an interactive, very clever, intuitive system that is lean and light and agile, built on the best technology. And I think that's the way. That's the future. I think moving away from this heavy, IT infrastructure systems, you can move away from it. Banks doing it, insurance companies are doing it. Shipping is just one of the traditional sectors that is still a little bit backdated. It's like a dinosaur. Some evolve and some died.
That's actually fantastic analogy. And for the last 10 minutes of the podcast, warm welcome to Pat, the Mobile Camera Studios. Where you rolling, Pat?
Actually today, Richard, I'm with Rex. We're in a separate truck. We just left a quarry. I'm not sure what we left here, but he told me I can't say anything more about it. I thought you might know a little bit more, being you know Rex a lot better than I do.
Oh yeah, but that's my other.
Uh,
That's my pseudonym, Rex Harrington. That's my
yeah.
author. I should say I am also an author, so I write books. And MI6, I do a lot. In the last 2 years, when COVID struck, when the shipping lines were making all this money, I decided to take a step back and write books.
That's actually a smart move. I mean, we've also seen Ryan Peterson from Flexport also writing some books. I think he wrote one with regards to Ever Given. But yeah, nevertheless, I just want to circle back real quick on the topic. And Elizabeth had a fantastic comment. She said she even remembers back then when the industry switched from analog to computers. However, I think still up to the current date, we still have some very old procedures, as Richard also already alluded to, that the carriers have to get rid of.
I think the other thing is outsourcing. A lot of outsourcing could be achieved. So certain shipping lines have outsourced call centers and stuff like that. But I think if you looked at reframing some of the ocean carriers and becoming not just the lean in terms of technology, but lean in their operations, lean in their workforce. I think there's been a lot of moves that you get some of the big systems integrators like WNS or Infosys or where I work with Wipro. You know, we used to do massive outsourcing, massive project outsourcing, and the benefits, as long as you withhold a percentage of the knowledge base that gives the security to the customer, then you can outsource a lot and you can reduce costs. And I think that these systems integrators now have some tremendous powerful tools in their arsenal, and they can bring a lot of value to the table in terms of automation and cost reductions and reorganization and structures that can make shipping lines even, well, let's say, more efficient, bring them up to date a little bit more, and then refocus on internal technology. So that's where I would leave it.
I would also add, Richard, because I think again you're making some very good points here, and I also think that by doing this, you as a shipping line also get to take out a whole chunk of time for internal development out of the equation, because as you said, those integrators already have, even if it's just similar products or similar tools or features, however you want to call them, you only have to adapt them and not build everything from scratch and testing and doing all that stuff, you know.
Now, wouldn't that, when you mentioned value, wouldn't that be like an economic value, let alone just the value of the product, but an economic value for the bottom line of the company? One, outsourcing the help, and two, not having to continue to update it and fix patch problems and everything else.
Well, I think that goes without saying, Pat. I think as long as you feel trust with the partner you go with, I think if like take the equation where Maersk sold IBM Maersk Data to IBM Global Services. IBM Global Services paid, I want to say, $1 billion for the company, and then I think Maersk gave them something like $2 or $3 billion worth of business on the back end. But in doing so, they got rid of something like 5,000 workforce, which IBM carved up or redistributed or whatever. But they kept a key core team that gave Maersk the confidence that they can move forward. But I think that's an analogy that has in the past worked. I mean, I'm going back 10, 12 years ago now, maybe longer, but the time goes so quickly. So, you know, but I think that other sectors of the business could be outsourced. But my believing is that inland logistics is critical to the ocean carriers. And I think the ones that look at better distribution patterns, better systems to tie cargo movements in, critical. And I think what I said to Christoph before you joined, Pat, was there are companies out there that can analyze they can basically analyze the flow from shipper to consignee through the whole supply chain, and they can actually put a value proposition together and say, is this actually a viable route? And they look at all different scenarios. They look at the type of cargo, they look at the mix of transport, they look at time patterns, they look at sensitivity, and they can assess this, and they can put it into an AI machine learning engine, and then they can actually come up and say, look, actually, this isn't the best way to move this. This is a better way to do it. And so if you started looking at that and you started analyzing trade patterns, you could possibly save a lot more money. And I think that the things like time sensitivity on certain cargoes coming into North America, you could then say, okay, this isn't time sensitive. We can stick it on a barge, as long as it got water in the Mississippi.
Correct. Yeah.
I'll turn that faucet back on next week.
Yeah.
That's one of my things that I've been saying right along here, Richard, is that if it belongs on a boat, it goes on a boat. If it belongs on a train, it goes on a train. Yeah. And if we can get something that would be able to end-to-end analyze that and bring the AMH portion into this, because it's not a part that people solve for right now, and open up the whole visual. I mean, they use it in Europe, between the Marco Polo and many of the places that use barges and different trade routes other than highway. So we just need to add that equation to the US, and I think we could show a lot more things.
Real quick, 2 minutes left. Just FYI, Raquel Flores, hey, thank you so much for joining us. Big welcome to the US, and just wanted to join or to jump upon what Pat just said. I also believe that we should get away of thinking that there is one fits it all, because it does not. There is just far many different types of containers, cargo, shippers, requirements, etc., you name it. So it just doesn't work that way if we say, okay, there is just this one option. Hence what you already alluded to, Pat. There is cargo which is perfectly designed for rail, truck, whatnot, right? And that's how it should be used, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we can add weight in certain areas and not in others, depending on what the shipper or the receiver needs, depending on the flow. Seasonal, who knows? I mean, to have that full analysis would be invaluable.
I think the end-to-end analysis, and certainly on the inland portion, is critical. But I also believe now maybe is the time for the big shippers to come together and say, let's have our own shipping line. And you know, where they've been pretty hammered by the ocean carriers for the last 2 years. All right, rates are going to come down, so they're going to start playing the game. You know, trust me, that the shipper has a long memory, so he's going to play that game with the ocean carriers. But
yes,
with the fewer carriers out there, he can't play as many games as he might want. But if he has the ammunition, if you provide the shipper with the tool to sort of analyze the cargo values and the cargo patterns, the trade patterns, he can start saying, okay, maybe if I did a comparison between Maersk and MSC and CMA, what is the best route? What is the best option? Now, at the moment, they go by money, or they go by time, or they go by, you know, sailing dates, but or cost. You know, there's a number of factors. But if you have the power to analyze from point to point, what is the best for me? Then you can start playing the game. The shippers can really start playing the games with the ocean carriers and start saying, right, let's get creative.
Yeah, and I like that idea about a coalition between a lot of major retailers here in the U.S. or for that matter anywhere else in the world. That's an interesting prospect I hadn't heard before.
Well, I leave it like this: the group you formed, Pat. I think you could probably go to an ocean shipper, a big shipper in the US, and probably say, "Look, we'll set up a shipping line for you. It's going to cost you a far less money overall. We'll look after all your inland logistics. We'll look at the distribution patterns. We'll implement systems that can, lean, agile systems that can give you better visibility. And we're not a flex port. Definitely not
Right.
for export, but with something
No.
creative can actually make money, and not use
Right.
investors' money. So, you know,
Right.
but the shipper could come, and maybe the shippers are the ones to turn to. And certainly you're in the best place to do it, because North America, you've got Walmart's, Lowe's, Home Depot, Anheuser-Busch,
Amazon.
you name them. Ford.
Mm.
Yeah, Amazon.
Well,
Jeff Bezos might
that's the hope
be
with
work
that's the hope with Richard, with Christoph and I, isn't it? To put this together and get their attention.
Absolutely. And the thing is, you even see it happening in Germany. I mean, I'm sure you guys know Lidl, which belongs to Kaufland, which is also a big German, initially German supermarket or superstore, so to speak, which also ventured out to the US, amongst other. And they just last year, throughout the pandemic, they just set up their own shipping line. Of course,
Yeah,
they don't have the
Lidl's
20,000.
and
Correct.
Aldi and
Lidl, yeah.
Lidl's, the German brothers, the two German brothers have created a monster of a supermarket chain. You know,
Yeah.
they're the next Tesco's, they're the next Walmarts.
Correct. And even with those, and of course those have, I suppose, a less volume than the Targets, the Walmarts, the Home Depots, you name them. But nevertheless, even Lidl set up that with Tradewinds their own shipping line. And as I said, of course, not the 20,000 plus TU vessels, but they have their regular own
Sometimes
services.
I wonder if the giant vessels, I know their economy of scale for the ocean line, but are they really for the customer and the port?
We were talking about that in the beginning. I'm sure Richard will be happy to answer that.
I think I raised that earlier, Pat. I think before you joined, I actually raised that whole subject. I brought it up and said, the economies of scale is a double-edged sword with the big ships. But I think our time has elapsed, so I think it's time for me to say goodbye from England.
Well, how about just for now, and we see if we can't do this again after the new year, and continue
Definitely.
on. We have to, because it was an amazing talk, and Richard, thank you so much. You're absolutely right. The time is up. But Pat, also thank you for taking your time as well and joining us.
I look forward to hearing the rest of this.
Oh yeah, you're gonna love it for sure.
And Christoph, is this being recorded? Is this being recorded? Have you recorded this?
Live.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's live on LinkedIn right now, and it will be also being uploaded up to Spotify and YouTube. I'm sure that I'll gonna share the link with you, and also for the audience, want to say
I'll probably get inundated with lawsuits tomorrow.
No,
it'll be something to do.
No,
there'll be some letters from Denmark, Switzerland, France. Shanghai as well. I did put the Chinese in there in the mix as well.
I think as long as you're in the UK, you don't have Germans. Maybe.
Hey, if we rattle enough feathers, we might find the right one to get it all done.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Absolutely. Appreciate you being on here, Richard. Thank you again for your time.
Well, let me know if you want me to join again. I'm happy to.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm sure also the audience loved it based on the feedback. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and looking forward seeing you the next time. And if you have any questions, please let us know. You can find all of us on LinkedIn. And wishing you an awesome day, and thanks again for joining. Take care. Bye-bye. Oh, can't hear you. You're mute.
Everybody left. I thought they would. Yeah, I thought they would stay behind to talk to you, but they left. So
that's okay. But yeah, it was fantastic talk, at least from my perspective. What do you think, Benita? Looking forward to your feedback. How are you doing, by the way? Quite
I am
some
doing
time
so good.
we haven't seen.
I know I'm recovered from the time zone. That was hard. And then now I'm dealing with the daylight savings.
Mhm.
And this is really my first winter back here, where it turns from fall to winter. So
Oh yeah.
really dry. My nose is bleeding. It's terrible.
Oh shoot.
I know. I
Shoot.
need to move.
Yeah, you should.
can't
Spain
handle
is
it.
awesome. Spain.
Yeah?
I found beautiful property there. Good Lord. Southern part of Spain, straight at the ocean. Good Lord.
Really? And was it
I
affordable?
it depends. I don't know about the prices up in Canada, but at least compared to German prices, yes, it's actually a bargain.
Yeah?
If you're asking me. Hmm.
Oh, good to know. Good to know. And yeah, I've been hearing good things about Portugal and Spain.
Hmm. Portugal as well. Same thing. Same
Right.
thing. And also for businesses, they offer fantastic tax incentives.
Right. And there's like a digital nomad
Yeah.
visa in Portugal. I don't know about Spain. Crazy stuff.
I don't know about Spain either, but yeah, I think that's a different conversation, I guess.
How did it go for you, Christoph?
Great, great. I realized throughout the talk that next time I should have to log on with my laptop first and then with the iPad